Let your breathing slow, your body relax, and allow yourself to drift into ancient worlds where heroes journey through impossible trials to claim their destiny. In the ancient city-state of Argos, nestled in the northeastern corner of the Peloponnese, there ruled a king named Acrisius. He was a powerful monarch, descended from a line of heroes that stretched back to Danaus himself. But despite all his wealth and authority, Acrisius is not a happy man. The source of his discontent was painfully simple. He had no son. In a world where kingdoms passed from father to son, where a man's legacy depended upon male heirs to carry his name and continue his lineage, this absence was not merely disappointing, it was catastrophic. Acrisius had one child, a daughter named Danae, and while she was beautiful beyond measure, in the patriarchal society of ancient Greece, her value lay primarily in whom she might marry and what sons she might produce for her husband's family, rather than her father's. Desperate for guidance, tormented by questions about the future of his kingdom and his legacy, Acrisius made a fateful decision. He would consult the oracle at Delphi, the sacred prophetess of Apollo, who could see what mortals could not, who spoke with the voice of the god himself. The journey to Delphi was long and arduous, winding through mountain passes and sacred groves. When Acrisius finally arrived at the temple and was granted his audience with the Pythia, he asked his question with all the urgency of a desperate man. "Will I have a son? How will my kingdom continue?" But the answer he received was not what he had hoped for. The oracle, speaking in the enigmatic way of prophets, delivered a message that would haunt Acrisius for the rest of his life. "You will have no son. Your daughter will bear a son, and by that son's hand you will meet your death." The prophecy hit Acrisius like a physical blow. Not only would he have no son of his own, but the grandson who might have been his consolation, the boy who might have continued his line, would instead become his murderer. The weight of fate pressed down upon him with unbearable force. In that moment, standing in the sacred temple with the smoke of incense heavy in the air, Acrisius made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events far greater than he could have imagined. If his grandson would kill him, then there must never be a grandson. Danae must never be allowed to bear a child. When Acrisius returned to Argos, he ordered the construction of a special prison for his daughter, a chamber entirely made of bronze, buried deep beneath the earth, or, in some versions of the tale, built as a tower standing isolated from the rest of the palace. This bronze chamber had no door, no window, no opening through which any man might enter. Within these walls, Danae was to be kept, a prisoner of her father's fear, guarded so closely that she could never meet a man, never marry, never bear the prophesied child. Poor Danae, innocent of any crime, found herself entombed in bronze, her only company a single faithful maidservant who brought her food and water through a small opening in the ceiling. She had committed no offense, harbored no ill will toward her father, yet she was condemned to live her entire life in darkness and isolation. Days turned to months, months to years, and still Danae remained in her bronze prison, the beauty of her youth fading unseen, her life slowly ebbing away in the artificial darkness of her father's making.
But Acrisius, for all his power and all his precautions, had made a fundamental error. He had tried to thwart fate, yes, but more than that, he had not considered all the ways a woman might be reached. He had locked out mortal men, but what of the gods? And indeed, it was a god who saw Danae in her prison, a god who desired her, a god who would not be deterred by bronze walls or a father's fear. Zeus, the king of the gods, lord of the sky and wielder of the thunderbolt, looked down from Olympus and saw the beautiful princess imprisoned beneath the earth. Perhaps he was moved by compassion for her plight, or perhaps he was simply captivated by her beauty. The ancient sources are unclear on his motivation, as they often are when it comes to Zeus's numerous affairs. But whatever the reason, Zeus decided he would have Danae. The question was how to reach her in her sealed chamber. Zeus, master of transformation, could take any form he wished. He could have appeared to her as a man, as an animal, as a phantom. But instead, he chose something far more unusual, far more poetic. He transformed himself into a shower of golden rain and poured through the tiny opening in the ceiling of Danae's chamber. The golden droplets fell upon her like liquid light, like divine blessing made manifest, and in that otherworldly encounter, Perseus was conceived. When Danae discovered she was pregnant, she must have been terrified. How could she explain this to her father? Who would believe that Zeus himself had visited her, that the child growing within her was the son of the king of the gods? Acrisius would surely think she had somehow found a way to meet a mortal man, that she had betrayed his trust and made a mockery of his precautions. And indeed, when Acrisius discovered that his daughter was with child, his rage was terrible to behold. In his fury, Acrisius demanded to know who the father was. Danae insisted it was Zeus, that she had been visited by the god in the form of golden rain, but her father did not believe her. How could he? It seemed far more likely that one of his servants had found a way into the chamber, or that Danae herself had somehow arranged an encounter with a lover. Either way, the prophecy he had tried so hard to prevent was now coming to pass. Danae had borne a son. Acrisius faced a terrible dilemma. The child was his grandson, his own blood, but he was also the agent of Acrisius's prophesied death. According to the oracle, this boy would one day kill him. The king could have killed the infant outright, could have ordered Danae and her baby executed, but Acrisius, despite his fear and his anger, could not bring himself to commit such a direct act of murder against his own kin. Perhaps he feared the wrath of the gods if he killed his grandson. Perhaps some remnant of love for his daughter stayed his hand. Or perhaps he simply hoped to evade the blood guilt that would come from kinslaying. Instead, Acrisius devised what he thought was a clever compromise. He would not kill Danae and the baby himself, but he would leave their fate to the gods and the sea. He ordered a wooden chest to be built, large enough to hold both mother and infant, but small enough to be sealed tight. Then, with his daughter and grandson inside, he had the chest thrown into the sea, casting them out onto the mercy of the waves. If they died, it would be the sea that killed them, not Acrisius. If by some miracle they survived, then they would be far from Argos, no longer his concern, and perhaps the prophecy would be averted after all.
The chest drifted for hours, perhaps days, tossed by wind and wave, with Danae holding her infant son close, singing to him, praying to Zeus to save them. Ancient poets would later imagine her prayers, her desperate pleas to the god who had fathered her child to now protect them both. And whether Zeus heard her prayers, or whether it was simply the workings of fate, the chest eventually came ashore on the island of Seriphos, one of the Cycladic islands in the Aegean Sea. It was there, on the rocky beaches of Seriphos, that a kindly fisherman named Dictys discovered the chest. He opened it to find a beautiful woman and a small boy, both miraculously alive despite their ordeal. Dictys, whose name means net, was the brother of Polydectes, the king of Seriphos. But unlike his royal brother, Dictys was a simple, good-hearted man who made his living from the sea. He took pity on the mother and child, brought them to his modest home, and gave them shelter. Danae told Dictys her story, the prophecy, the bronze chamber, the visit from Zeus, her father's rage, and their abandonment at sea. Whether Dictys believed that Zeus was truly Perseus's father is unclear, but he was moved by their plight. He promised to protect them, to keep them safe, and to ask for nothing in return except that they live peacefully under his care. And so, for the first time since her imprisonment, Danae knew something resembling freedom and safety. And Perseus, the child who would one day become one of Greece's greatest heroes,
grew up in the humble household of a fisherman on a small island far from the kingdom that should have been his birthright. The years passed peacefully on Seriphos. Perseus grew from infant to child to young man, learning the fisherman's trade from Dictys, playing on the beaches, exploring the rocky hills of the island. He was strong and clever, quick to learn, and generous in spirit. He had no idea of his divine parentage, knew nothing of the prophecy that had led to his abandonment, understood nothing of the kingdom in Argos that should have been his grandfather's legacy and might have been his own. He was simply Perseus, the foster son of a kindly fisherman, living a quiet life on a quiet island. But Perseus's peaceful existence was not destined to last forever. As he grew into a handsome young man, his mother Danae retained her extraordinary beauty despite the passage of years. And that beauty eventually attracted the attention of someone far more dangerous than any monster, Polydectes, the king of Seriphos, the brother of the good Dictys who had saved them so long ago. Polydectes was not at all like his brother. Where Dictys was kind and generous, Polydectes was cruel and grasping. Where Dictys asked for nothing, Polydectes demanded everything. The king had seen Danae and desired her for himself, wanted to make her his wife, but he faced one significant obstacle, Perseus. The young man was fiercely protective of his mother and made it clear that he would never allow Polydectes to force her into an unwanted marriage. As long as Perseus was on the island, as long as he stood between the king and his mother, Polydectes could not have what he wanted. So Polydectes began to scheme, to devise a way to remove Perseus from Seriphos, ideally permanently. The king was cunning, and he understood that he needed to be careful. Perseus was popular among the people of the island, respected for his character and his strength. If he simply had him killed or exiled without cause, there might be unrest, perhaps even rebellion. No, he needed a better plan, a way to get rid of Perseus that would seem justified, even heroic. And so Polydectes conceived a trap, one that would play on Perseus's youth, his pride, and his desire to prove himself worthy of his mother's love and his foster father's kindness. The king announced that he was going to marry not Danae, but another woman, a princess from a neighboring island. He invited all the young men of Seriphos to a great banquet in honor of his upcoming wedding, and he declared that each guest should bring a gift, specifically a horse, which was the traditional contribution to such an occasion. This presented a problem for Perseus. He had no wealth, no land, no horses. He was the foster son of a fisherman, living on the generosity of Dictys. He had nothing to give. When Perseus arrived at the banquet empty-handed, Polydectes made a great show of surprise and disappointment. Before all the assembled guests, he expressed his dismay that Perseus had come to such an important event without a proper gift. The other young men had brought fine horses, the king pointed out, but Perseus had brought nothing. This was a calculated insult, designed to humiliate Perseus in front of everyone, to make him feel small and worthless. Perseus, stung by the public shame and desperate to prove himself, made a rash promise. In a voice loud enough for all to hear, he declared that he would bring Polydectes any gift he desired, any gift at all, no matter how difficult to obtain. If the king wanted something more impressive than a horse, Perseus would get it for him. Name it, and it would be done. Polydectes smiled. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Very well, the king said. If Perseus truly meant what he said, if he truly could bring any gift, then he should bring the head of Medusa, the Gorgon. There was a moment of stunned silence in the hall. Everyone knew what this meant. The Gorgons were monsters, creatures of nightmare, and Medusa, though mortal unlike her sisters, was the most feared creature in all the Greek world. Her gaze turned men to stone. To seek her out was to seek certain death. Polydectes might as well have asked Perseus to bring back his own head, because no one who faced Medusa ever returned alive. But Perseus, trapped by his own pride and his foolish promise, could not back down. To refuse now would be to admit cowardice before everyone who mattered in his world. He was young, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, and like many young men, he had more courage than sense. So he agreed he would bring back the head of Medusa. And with those words, Perseus set foot on a path that would transform him from a simple fisherman's foster son into one of the greatest heroes Greece would ever know. The morning after the banquet, as the implications of his promise began to sink in, Perseus must have felt a growing sense of horror. What had he done? He had agreed to hunt and kill one of the most terrifying creatures in existence, a monster whose very gaze meant instant death. He had no weapons, no armor, no knowledge of where to even begin looking for the Gorgons. He was, in every practical sense, doomed. Polydectes had set him an impossible task, and Perseus knew it. But a promise was a promise, especially one made publicly before witnesses. To refuse now would be to lose all honor, to become a laughingstock, to prove Polydectes right in his contempt. Before we follow Perseus on his quest, we must first understand exactly what he had agreed to face. The Gorgons were three sisters, Steno the mighty, Euryale the far-springer, and Medusa the queen, daughters of the ancient sea gods Phorcys and Ceto. They were monsters in the truest sense, beings from an older, darker time when the world was still wild and chaotic. They lived in the far west, at the edge of the world, in a place beyond the normal bounds of human civilization, beyond the reach of the Olympian gods' ordering influence. The Gorgons were described as having faces so hideous that no mortal could look upon them and live. But more than their ugliness, it was their eyes that were truly deadly. A single direct glance from a Gorgon would turn the viewer instantly to stone, transforming living flesh into cold marble in a heartbeat. Their hair was not hair at all, but living serpents that writhed and hissed around their heads. They had wings of gold that allowed them to fly, claws of bronze that could rend metal as easily as cloth, and teeth like boar's tusks that could tear a man apart. Of the three sisters, two, Steno and Euryale, were immortal, unable to be killed by any mortal means. But the third, Medusa, was mortal. She could be killed. It was this fact, this single vulnerability in an otherwise invincible trio, that made Polydectes' command theoretically possible. Perseus had been ordered to bring back Medusa's head, the only one of the three Gorgon heads that could actually be severed and carried away. But Medusa's mortality was a relatively recent development in the mythic timeline, and her story was one of the great tragedies of the ancient world. According to the Roman poet Ovid, whose account has become the most famous version of her backstory, Medusa had once been a beautiful mortal woman, a priestess in the temple of Athena. Her hair was her glory, flowing locks that were the envy of women throughout the world. She served the virgin goddess Athena faithfully, maintaining her own chastity as was required of Athena's priestesses, living a life of pious devotion. But Medusa's beauty attracted the attention of Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes, one of the most powerful of the Olympian gods. Poseidon, like many of the male gods in Greek mythology, did not take rejection well, and he did not care about the sanctity of Athena's temple or Medusa's vows of chastity. According to Ovid's account, Poseidon raped Medusa in Athena's temple, violating both the woman and the sacred space in one terrible act. One might expect that Athena, as goddess of wisdom and protector of women in certain contexts, would have punished Poseidon for this outrage. But the gods did not operate on mortal principles of justice. Athena could not or would not strike against her uncle Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods of Olympus. Instead, in a miscarriage of justice that has resonated through millennia, Athena punished Medusa herself, the victim of the assault. The goddess transformed Medusa's beautiful hair into a mass of living serpents. She made her face so hideous that anyone who looked upon it would turn to stone. She cursed Medusa to become the monster she would be known as forever, stripping away her humanity, her beauty, her priesthood, her very identity. Medusa fled to the ends of the earth, to a cave in the far west where she and her sisters made their lair, and there she became the terror of all who sailed those waters. Ships that came too near would find their crews turned to stone, perfect marble statues forever frozen in poses of terror. Any who sought the Gorgons with thoughts of glory would become just another statue in the garden of the damned that surrounded their cave.
This, then, was what Perseus had promised to confront, a victim transformed into a monster by divine injustice, a creature whose very gaze meant death, a being who lived at the uttermost edge of the world, surrounded by the petrified remains of heroes who had come before and failed. The task seemed not merely impossible, but suicidal. A wiser man might have fled Seriphos entirely, accepting exile as preferable to certain death. But Perseus, young and stubborn and unwilling to let his mother be forced into a marriage with the odious Polydectes, prepared to set out on his quest. What Perseus did not know, could not know, was that he was not truly alone, that the gods themselves were taking an interest in his fate. For if Danae had spoken truly about his conception, then Perseus was the son of Zeus, which made him a demigod, a half-mortal child of the king of the gods. And Zeus, for all his many faults and his innumerable infidelities, had a tendency to look after his half-mortal children, at least when it suited him. Moreover, Perseus had another powerful ally among the gods, though he did not yet know it. Athena, the goddess who had cursed Medusa in the first place, had her own reasons for wanting the Gorgon slain. Some later interpreters have suggested that perhaps Athena felt some measure of guilt for what she had done to Medusa, that perhaps helping Perseus was a way of seeking some form of redemption for her cruel punishment of an innocent victim. Or perhaps Athena simply wanted Medusa's death for her own purposes, wanting to acquire the Gorgon's head for its powerful magic. Whatever her motivation, Athena decided that Perseus would succeed where all others had failed. As Perseus stood on the shore of Seriphos, preparing to depart on his impossible quest, two figures appeared before him, Hermes and Athena, messenger of the gods and goddess of wisdom. Their appearance in Perseus's time of need was not purely coincidental. It was orchestrated by Zeus, who had commanded them to help his son. Both gods were half-siblings to Perseus, children of Zeus by other mothers, and they came bearing gifts and guidance that would make his quest possible. Hermes, with his characteristic good humor and eloquence, explained to Perseus that the quest ahead would require more than mortal strength or courage. To defeat Medusa, Perseus would need special weapons and tools, magical items that existed only in certain corners of the world, guarded by beings older than the Olympian gods. And more than that, he would need knowledge, specifically knowledge of where the Gorgons actually lived, for their lair was hidden in the distant west, beyond the normal maps of the world. Athena, more serious and tactical, gave Perseus the first of the magical items he would need, a shield made of polished bronze, burnished until it shone like a mirror. The shield's surface was so bright, so reflective, that one could see in it as clearly as in any looking glass. This shield, Athena explained, was the key to defeating Medusa. Perseus must never look directly at the Gorgon. The moment his eyes met hers, he would turn to stone. But if he used the shield as a mirror, if he looked only at Medusa's reflection, he could approach her safely.
The polished surface would show him where she was and what she was doing without requiring him to meet her deadly gaze. Hermes provided the second crucial item, a sword, or in some accounts a harp, a curved blade particularly suited for beheading. This was no ordinary weapon. It was adamantine, made of a divine metal harder than any mortal bronze or iron, sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's neck despite her supernatural nature. With this blade, Perseus might actually succeed in severing Medusa's head. But these two items, invaluable as they were not sufficient. There were other magical items Perseus would need, objects that would help him escape after he killed Medusa, for the two immortal Gorgon sisters would certainly pursue any mortal who harmed their sister. These other items, however, were not in the possession of the gods. They were held by others, by beings who dwelt in places Perseus had never heard of. And to find those places, to learn the locations of both the Gorgons and the guardians of the magical items, Perseus would first have to find and coerce information from three very strange and very ancient sisters, the Graiae. The Graiae, whose name meant the Gray Ones, were daughters of the same primordial sea gods who had spawned the Gorgons, which made them sisters to Sino, Euryale, and Medusa. They were ancient beyond measure, born old and gray, and they would never age further or die. The three sisters shared, among them, a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed back and forth between themselves as needed. This bizarre arrangement meant that at any given moment, only one of them could see, and only one could eat. The Graiae lived in a distant, desolate land, far from human civilization, in a place of eternal twilight that matched their gray nature. Hermes and Athena told Perseus that only the Graiae knew where to find the nymphs who possessed the remaining magical items Perseus would need. The Graiae also knew the location of the Gorgon's lair. But, the gods warned, the Gray Sisters would not give up this information willingly. They were loyal to their Gorgon sisters, and they would never knowingly help someone who sought to harm Medusa. Perseus would have to trick them, force them to reveal what they knew through guile rather than asking politely. With their guidance given and their gifts bestowed, Hermes and Athena departed, leaving Perseus to begin his journey. The young hero set out from Seriphos with nothing but the shield and the sword, heading north and west, following the directions the gods had given him. He traveled for days, perhaps weeks, through lands growing increasingly strange and desolate, until he came at last to the place where the Graiae dwelt. The land of the Gray Sisters was a place without sun, wrapped in perpetual fog and mist, where everything seemed faded and old. Perseus found the three sisters sitting together, their ancient forms barely visible through the gloom, passing their single eye back and forth as they shared the duty of keeping watch. Enyo was handing the eye to Dino, and Dino would pass it to Pemphredo, and then back again in an endless cycle. They sensed Perseus's presence, even when the one with the eye could not see him, for they were creatures of the ancient world, attuned to things mortals could not perceive. Perseus watched them carefully, waiting for his moment. Then, just as one sister was reaching to take the eye from another, in that brief instant when the eye traveled between hands and none of them could see, Perseus darted forward and snatched it away. The Graiae shrieked in dismay and outrage, groping blindly for the stolen eye, demanding its return. Perseus held it just out of their reach, and in a voice as firm as he could make it, announced that he would return their eye only if they told him what he needed to know. The Graiae, desperate and helpless without their sight, had no choice but to bargain. They cursed Perseus for his trickery, warned him of the fate that awaited any mortal who dared to face the Gorgons, but ultimately they told him what he needed to know. They revealed the location of the nymphs who guarded the magical items. In some versions, these were the Hesperides, who lived in a garden at the western edge of the world. In others, they were nymphs of the north, dwelling in the realm of eternal winter. And they told him where to find the Gorgons themselves, on an island called Sarpedon, in the distant ocean that surrounded the world. Having gotten what he needed, Perseus kept his word. He returned the eye to the Graii and hurried away before they could gather their wits and perhaps alert the Gorgons to his coming. The Graii's curses followed him as he departed, their ancient voices promising that he would soon join the garden of stone statues that surrounded his prey. But Perseus had the information he needed. Now he had to find the nymphs and acquire the final pieces of equipment that would make his quest possible. Following the Gray Sisters' directions, he traveled to wherever the nymphs dwelt. The accounts vary, but all agree that it was far from any human habitation, a place of great beauty and peace where time seemed to flow differently than in the mortal world. The nymphs, when Perseus found them, were far kinder than the Graii. They had been expecting him, having been told by the gods that a hero would come seeking their help. They provided him with 3 items, each more wondrous than the last. First was the cap of Hades, also called the helm of darkness, which rendered its wearer invisible. Second were the winged sandals that had once belonged to Hermes, though the god had lent them for this quest. These sandals allowed the wearer to fly through the air as swiftly as thought. Third was a special bag called a kibisis, a magical sack that would safely contain Medusa's head after Perseus severed it, for the head would retain its power to turn onlookers to stone even after death. With these items added to his shield and sword, Perseus was as prepared as any mortal could be to face the Gorgon. The nymphs wished him well, their ancient eyes filled with both hope and sadness, for they had seen many heroes over the long centuries of their lives, and not all of them had returned from their quests. Perseus thanked them, donned the winged sandals, and took to the sky, flying westward toward the ocean, toward the island of Sarpedon, toward his destiny. As he flew, Perseus must have had time to think about what he was about to attempt. He was going to confront a creature whose gaze turned men to stone, in a lair surrounded by the petrified remains of previous heroes who had tried and failed. He would have to get close enough to strike off her head without ever looking directly at her. He would have to do all this while potentially dealing with her 2 immortal sisters, who could not be killed and who would certainly try to stop him. And even if he succeeded, he would have to escape with the head all the way back to Seriphos, a journey of unknown distance across lands and seas that held their own dangers. It was not a quest for the faint of heart, but Perseus was no longer the naive young man who had made a rash promise at a banquet. The journey had changed him. His encounters with gods and ancient beings had opened his eyes to the reality of a world far larger and stranger than he had imagined growing up on Seriphos. He was still afraid. Only a fool would not be afraid of what lay ahead, but his fear was tempered now with purpose. He would defeat Medusa, or he would die trying. Either way, his mother would be safe from Polydectes, for even in death, Perseus's attempt would make it impossible for the king to force Danae to marry him without appearing cruel and heartless. But Perseus was determined not to fail. He had been given gifts by gods, guidance by ancient beings, a destiny that seemed larger than himself. As the island of Sarpedon appeared in the distance, rising from the dark waters of the ocean like a tooth from ancient jaws, Perseus tightened his grip on his sword, adjusted the shield on his arm, and prepared to face the Gorgon who had haunted his nightmares since the quest began. The slaying of Medusa. The island of Sarpedon was not like any place Perseus had ever seen. As he descended from the sky on his winged sandals, approaching cautiously and keeping the cap of invisibility ready in case he needed to hide himself quickly, he saw that the land itself seemed dead or dying. No trees grew on the rocky ground. No birds sang in the perpetual twilight that seemed to hang over the place. The air was thick and heavy, difficult to breathe, as though even the wind itself was reluctant to blow through this cursed location. But what truly made Perseus's blood run cold was the garden of statues. They were everywhere, scattered across the approach to the cave where the Gorgons dwelt. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of stone figures, each frozen in postures of terror or agony or desperate flight. These were not works of art carved by patient hands, but men transformed in an instant from living flesh to cold marble by Medusa's deadly gaze. Here stood a warrior with his sword raised, his face locked in an expression of futile determination. There lay a sailor who had tried to run, forever caught mid-stride, his face twisted in fear. Another figure was on his knees, hands raised in a useless gesture of supplication, or perhaps trying to block his view of the monster. Each statue was a testament to the Gorgon's power and a warning to any who approached. Perseus landed at the edge of this field of petrified victims, his feet touching the stony ground as quietly as possible. He had hoped to find the Gorgons sleeping, for Hermes and Athena had told him that the sisters did sometimes sleep, and that would be his best chance to approach Medusa without attracting the attention of her immortal sisters. Perseus crept forward slowly, careful not to look directly ahead, his eyes fixed on the reflection in his polished shield. The shield showed him the path forward, let him see the statues he needed to avoid, but kept him from accidentally catching a glimpse of the Gorgons, should they be awake. The cave entrance loomed before him, a great dark mouth in the rocky hillside. The smell that emanated from within was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, reptilian musk, and something else, something ancient and wrong that made Perseus's skin crawl. He could hear sounds from within the cave, the rustling of scales, the occasional hiss of serpents, and beneath it all, a rhythmic sound that might have been breathing. Were they asleep? Perseus prayed to every god he could name that they were. Holding the shield before him like a lantern, using its reflection to navigate, Perseus entered the cave. The light grew dimmer as he moved deeper into the Gorgon's lair, but the polished bronze of the shield caught even the faintest illumination and showed him what lay ahead. And there, in the depths of the cave, Perseus saw them, the 3 Gorgon sisters.
They were vast, far larger than he had imagined. Their bodies were those of women, but twisted and corrupted, covered with scales that shimmered with an oily, unnatural sheen. Their wings, which Hermes had described as golden, looked more like the wings of enormous bats or dragons, leathery and powerful, folded against their backs as they rested. Their hands ended in cruel bronze claws that looked sharp enough to tear through armor. But it was their heads that truly horrified Perseus. The serpents that formed their hair were not decorative or symbolic, but real, living snakes that moved independently, their tongues flicking the air, their eyes glinting in the darkness. The sisters' faces, reflected in the shield, were so grotesque that even the reflection made Perseus want to look away. And there, in the center, between her 2 sisters, lay Medusa. She looked much like Steno and Euryale, but there were subtle differences. Perhaps it was Perseus's imagination, or perhaps it was real. But in the reflection on his shield, Medusa seemed somehow sadder than her sisters, her posture more weary, as though the weight of her curse bore down upon her even in sleep. The serpents of her hair moved more slowly than those of her sisters, almost languorous, and her face, horrifying as it was, seemed to carry an echo of the beauty she had once possessed. Perseus felt an unexpected stab of pity for the creature before him. This was not some mindless monster that had been spawned in the darkness to plague humanity. This had been a woman once, a priestess, a victim of divine injustice who had been punished for a crime she had not committed. But pity, Perseus realized, did not change what had to be done. The petrified statues outside made it clear that Medusa, victim though she might have been, was also a killer, and Perseus had a duty to his mother, a promise to keep, a quest to complete. All 3 Gorgons appeared to be sleeping, their breathing deep and regular.
Perseus could approach Medusa without waking her, but he would have to be incredibly careful not to disturb either of the immortal sisters. If Steno and Euryale woke before he could sever Medusa's head and escape, they would tear him apart, invisibility cap or no invisibility cap. They were stronger and faster than any mortal, and in the confines of the cave, Perseus would have no room to maneuver or flee. Moving with exquisite care, Perseus approached Medusa, his eyes fixed on her reflection in the shield. He held the adamantine sword ready in his right hand, the shield in his left, positioning himself as close as he dared. He could smell her now, a scent of serpents and old blood. The snakes in her hair sensed his presence and began to stir, hissing softly, but Medusa herself did not wake. One chance. Perseus would have one chance to strike. The cut had to be perfect, had to sever the head completely in a single blow, because if Medusa woke, if she opened her eyes, it would all be over. Perseus raised the sword, holding the shield steady with his other hand, watching the reflection carefully to judge distance and angle. His heart hammered in his chest so loudly he was certain it would wake the Gorgons. His hands were sweating despite the cool dampness of the cave, but his grip on the sword was firm and his arm did not shake. He had come too far to fail now. Then, in one smooth motion, guided by Athena herself, according to later poets, Perseus brought the adamantine blade down with all his strength, slicing through Medusa's neck as cleanly as a farmer's scythe through grain. The head separated from the body instantly, falling to the cave floor as Perseus quickly scooped it up and thrust it into the cabesus, closing the magical bag before the severed head could turn him to stone.
But even as Perseus completed this motion, two incredible things happened simultaneously. First, from Medusa's severed neck, not blood alone, but two beings sprang forth. Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant wielding a golden sword. These were the children that Medusa had been carrying when she was transformed into a Gorgon, the offspring of her violation by Poseidon, who had grown within her all this time, trapped in her monstrous form, until Perseus's sword set them free. Pegasus immediately spread his wings and burst from the cave out into the open air, while Chrysaor stood dazed, trying to comprehend his sudden birth. Second, and far more dangerous for Perseus, Steno and Euryale woke up. Their sister's blood spraying across the cave floor, the violent movement of Perseus grabbing the head, the sudden appearance of Pegasus and Chrysaor, it was too much disturbance for even deeply sleeping creatures to ignore. The two immortal Gorgons opened their eyes and saw, in the dim light of the cave, a mortal standing over their sister's headless corpse, holding a bag that must contain her severed head. Their screams of rage and grief were deafening, a sound like metal scraping on metal, mixed with the howls of tortured beasts. They lunged toward Perseus, claws extended, wings spreading, serpents writhing in fury. But Perseus was already moving. He jammed the cap of Hades onto his head and vanished from sight, even as the Gorgon's claws slashed through the space where he had been standing. Invisible, Perseus ran for the cave entrance, dodging around the confused Chrysaor and the headless corpse of Medusa, while behind him, Steno and Euryale shrieked in frustrated rage, unable to see their prey. The immortal sisters burst from the cave in pursuit, following the sounds of Perseus's footsteps, following the trail of blood drops from the severed head that leaked through the cabesus. They took to the air, their great wings beating powerfully, searching for any sign of the invisible murderer who had killed their sister. But Perseus had already activated the winged sandals on his feet. He shot into the sky, still invisible, flying at a speed the Gorgons could not match. He could hear them behind him, screaming, searching, but with every passing moment the distance between them grew greater. Perseus flew east, back toward the lands of civilization, clutching the bag that contained Medusa's head. Below him, drops of the Gorgon's blood fell from the cabeces, and wherever they struck the earth, they had strange effects.
According to the ancient poets, those drops of blood that fell on the rocky soil of Libya created the many species of venomous snakes that inhabited that region, while drops that fell into the sea created the red coral that divers would later prize. Even in death, even severed from its body, Medusa's power was transforming the world. Eventually, Perseus left the Gorgon sisters behind. They returned, grieving and enraged, to their cave, to their sister's body, unable to pursue further or to avenge what had been done. Perseus flew on, exhausted but triumphant, hardly believing he had actually succeeded. He had done what every other hero who had tried had failed to do. He had slain the Gorgon Medusa and taken her head, the only trophy that could prove the impossible had been accomplished. But Perseus's adventures were far from over. The journey back to Seriphos would be long, and fate had other encounters in store for the young hero. For as he flew over the lands of North Africa, he would discover that the Gorgon's head he carried would save another life, would win him a bride, and would prove to be the key to fulfilling not just his promise to Polydectes, but a destiny far greater than he had ever imagined.
Perseus flew eastward for days, the winged sandals carrying him tirelessly across vast distances, over lands he had never heard of and seas whose names no Greek knew. He was exhausted but elated, scarcely able to believe that he still lived, that he had actually succeeded in his impossible quest. The cabesus, containing Medusa's head, hung at his side, and Perseus was careful never to open it, never to look inside, for he knew that the head's power remained undiminished by death. Anyone who looked upon it directly would still turn to stone. As Perseus flew over the sun-baked lands of what the Greeks called Ethiopia, but which might have been anywhere along the southern Mediterranean coast, he noticed something strange on the shore below. There, chained to a rocky outcropping at the water's edge, was a young woman. She was stripped nearly naked, her arms spread and bound to the rock in a pose of helpless exposure. From this height, Perseus could not see her face clearly, but he could see that she was not alone. On the beach nearby stood a small group of people, a man wearing a crown, a woman richly dressed, and several attendants, all watching the chained woman with expressions of anguish and horror. Perseus's first thought was that he was witnessing some form of execution, some terrible punishment for a crime. But as he descended for a closer look, he realized that everyone's attention was not on the chained woman, but on the sea beyond her. They were waiting for something, watching the water with fearful anticipation. And then Perseus saw it, a disturbance in the ocean, a rippling of the waves, and rising from the depths came a creature of nightmare, the sea monster called Cetus. Cetus was enormous, a serpentine beast with scales like armor and jaws that could swallow a ship whole. Its eyes gleamed with bestial hunger, and its roar shook the very air as it approached the helpless woman chained to the rock. This was no execution, it was a sacrifice. The woman was being offered to the monster, left bound and defenseless to be devoured. Perseus did not hesitate. Without fully understanding the situation, knowing nothing of who these people were or why this sacrifice was happening, he simply knew that he could not stand by and watch an innocent person be killed by a monster. He had just slain the Gorgon Medusa. Surely he could deal with a sea creature, no matter how large and terrible it appeared. Swooping down, Perseus alighted on the rock beside the chained woman. Up close, he could see that she was young, perhaps near his own age, and heartbreakingly beautiful despite her terror. Her eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down her face, and she flinched when Perseus appeared suddenly beside her. He quickly assured her that he meant no harm, that he was there to help. Her name, she told him between sobs, was Andromeda, and she was the daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia of this land. And no, she had committed no crime, done nothing to deserve this fate. She was here because of her mother's hubris, because of words spoken in pride, because of the gods' anger at mortal arrogance. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by Andromeda's fear and the approaching monster, but Perseus pieced it together. Queen Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter Andromeda was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who were the daughters of the sea god Nereus. This was not merely vanity, it was hubris, the dangerous pride that placed mortals above their station, that claimed to surpass even the divine. The Nereids had complained to their patron, Poseidon, god of the sea, and Poseidon, the same god who had violated Medusa in Athena's temple, who showed no mercy to those who offended him, had sent floods and the monster Cetus to ravage this land. King Cepheus had consulted the oracle of Ammon, desperately seeking a solution to the devastation afflicting his kingdom. The oracle's answer was as cruel as it was clear. The only way to appease Poseidon's wrath was to sacrifice Andromeda to the monster, chain her to the rock, and let Cetus devour her. Only then would the gods' anger be satisfied. And so, despite their love for their daughter, despite the anguish at what they were being forced to do, Cepheus and Cassiopeia had brought Andromeda to this rock and chained her here to await her terrible fate.
Perseus felt rage rising within him as he heard this story. This was the second time in his recent experience that he had encountered the injustice of divine punishment. Medusa, punished for being raped. Andromeda, punished for her mother's boast. The gods, it seemed, had a cruel habit of making the innocent suffer for the crimes of others. But unlike with Medusa, where he had arrived too late to prevent the curse, Perseus was here in time to save Andromeda from her undeserved fate. "I will slay this monster," Perseus told Andromeda, his voice filled with certainty. "You will not die today." Andromeda looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Cetus was almost upon them, close enough now that Perseus could see the barnacles clinging to its scales, could smell the stench of rotting fish on its breath. The creature opened its vast jaws, revealing rows of teeth like swords, and roared its hunger. Perseus turned to face the sea monster, drawing the adamantine sword that had severed Medusa's head. The weapon felt light in his hand, balanced perfectly, still sharp despite its recent use. But Perseus had no intention of fighting Cetus conventionally. He had a much more effective weapon at his disposal. Keeping his eyes averted, Perseus opened the cabesus just enough to draw out Medusa's head by its serpent hair, being careful never to look at the face directly. As Cetus lunged toward Andromeda, jaws wide open for the kill, Perseus held up the Gorgon's head directly in the monster's path. The sea creature's eyes focused on the severed head for just an instant, meeting the dead gaze of Medusa. That instant was enough. Cetus froze in mid-lunge, its enormous form transforming in a heartbeat from living flesh to solid stone. The petrified monster crashed into the water with a tremendous splash, sinking beneath the waves as a statue, dead and harmless forever. On the beach, King Cepheus, Queen Cassiopeia, and their attendants stood in stunned silence, scarcely able to believe what they had just witnessed. Perseus quickly returned Medusa's head to the cabesus and used his sword to strike the chains binding Andromeda to the rock. She collapsed into his arms, weak from her ordeal, sobbing with relief and shock. When Perseus carried Andromeda to shore, King Cepheus rushed forward, embracing his daughter with tears of joy streaming down his face. Cassiopeia, too, wept to see her child alive and safe, though there was also guilt in her tears, for she knew that her vanity had brought this catastrophe upon her family. The king turned to Perseus, demanding to know who this young hero was, who this stranger was who had saved his daughter when all had seemed lost. Perseus introduced himself simply, Perseus of Seriphos, son of Danae, on his way home from a quest. He did not mention his divine father, did not boast of his accomplishments, but when Cepheus learned that this young man had not only saved Andromeda from Cetus, but had done so using the head of the Gorgon Medusa, which meant he had actually succeeded in slaying one of the most feared creatures in existence, The king's admiration and gratitude knew no bounds. Cepheus insisted that Perseus come to the palace, that he be honored as the greatest hero to ever set foot in their land. During the celebrations that followed, as Perseus told the story of his quest and his journey, he found himself unable to stop looking at Andromeda. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was intelligent and kind, brave despite her recent ordeal, and she seemed to see Perseus not as a great hero, but as a person, a young man not so different from herself. And Andromeda, for her part, was drawn to Perseus with equal intensity. He had saved her life, yes, but beyond that, there was something about him, his courage tempered with compassion, his strength combined with gentleness, that captured her heart. By the end of the first evening, Perseus knew he was in love. By the end of the second day, so did everyone else. King Cepheus, seeing the connection between his daughter and her rescuer, made Perseus an offer. Marry Andromeda, and as her dowry, you will receive a substantial portion of my kingdom. It was a generous offer, far more than Perseus had any right to expect. He was, after all, just supposedly the foster son of a fisherman from a small island. But Perseus's true identity had begun to emerge during his quest, and Cepheus recognized in him something royal, something worthy of a princess. Perseus accepted with joy. Andromeda accepted with even greater happiness. A wedding was quickly arranged, for both young people were eager to begin their life together, and besides, Perseus needed to complete his journey back to Seriphos to deliver Medusa's head to Polydectes and ensure his mother's safety. The wedding would be immediate, and then Perseus and his new bride would depart together for their homeland. But there was a problem, one that Cepheus had failed to mention in his generous offer of his daughter's hand. Andromeda had already been promised to another man before the sacrifice to Cetus, to Phineus, who was Cepheus's own brother, making him Andromeda's uncle. Phineus had agreed to the sacrifice, had done nothing to try to save Andromeda when she was chained to the rock, had watched from a safe distance as Cetus approached to devour her.
But now that she was safe, now that there was no danger, Phineus suddenly decided he wanted his bride after all. On the evening of the wedding feast, just as Perseus and Andromeda were about to be formally married, Phineus burst into the hall with a group of armed men behind him. He declared that Andromeda belonged to him by prior claim, that Cepheus had no right to give her to Perseus. The king tried to reason with his brother, pointing out that Phineus had abandoned Andromeda to her fate, that Perseus had saved her when Phineus had not lifted a finger to help. But Phineus was unmoved. He wanted Andromeda, or at least he wanted to prevent Perseus from having her, and he was prepared to take her by force. What followed was a violent confrontation. Phineus's men attacked, and Perseus was forced to defend himself and his bride. He fought valiantly, his sword skills honed by his recent trials, and he held his own against multiple attackers. But there were too many of them, and Perseus was being forced back, surrounded, on the verge of being overwhelmed. Andromeda screamed for him to do something, anything. Her father and those loyal to him were also fighting, but they too were outnumbered. Perseus made a terrible decision. He called out to everyone who was loyal to him, to Cepheus, to Andromeda, to look away, close their eyes, turn their faces to the wall. Then, with a mixture of regret and determination, he reached into the cabesus and pulled out Medusa's head. He held it high, turning it toward Phineus and his men, and shouted for them to see what they faced. Phineus and his soldiers looked up at Perseus's shout, and in that instant they saw the Gorgon's face. The transformation was instantaneous. One by one they turned to stone, frozen in various poses of attack or surprise. Phineus himself, caught in mid-stride running toward Perseus with his sword raised, became a statue, his features locked in eternal rage and greed. The hall fell silent, except for the sound of stone falling on stone as petrified weapons clattered from petrified hands. Perseus quickly returned the head to the bag and told those who had obeyed him that it was safe to look again.
King Cepheus stared in horror at the stone figure of his brother, at the dozens of stone soldiers now scattered throughout his hall. Queen Cassiopeia wept at the violence, at the deaths, even though those deaths had been necessary to protect Perseus and Andromeda. Perseus felt no triumph in what he had done, only a grim acknowledgement of necessity. He had used Medusa's head to kill, to turn living men into stone statues, continuing the cycle of the Gorgon's curse even after her death. He had become, in a sense, the agent of her power, wielding her lethal gaze for his own purposes. It was a heavy burden, and it would become heavier still before his journey ended. But for now, Perseus had his bride, and more importantly, Andromeda had her life and her freedom. The wedding proceeded, though in a more subdued fashion than originally planned, with the stone statues of Phineus and his men as silent witnesses. Perseus and Andromeda were married, bound together not just by law, but by genuine love, by shared danger survived, by a sense that they were meant to find each other. And when the ceremonies were complete, Perseus said farewell to King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, promising to send word once they reached Seriphos, and set off with Andromeda to complete his quest. Return to Seriphos and the fulfillment of prophecy. The flight back to Seriphos, with Perseus carrying his new bride using the winged sandals, took several days. During that journey, Perseus told Andromeda everything about his origins, the prophecy that had led to his mother and his abandonment at sea, their rescue by Dictys, the threat from King Polydectes, and the rash promise that had sent him on his quest.
For Medusa's head, Andromeda listened to all of this with understanding and sympathy, and she assured Perseus that whatever they might face upon reaching Seriphos, they would face it together. As they approached the island, Perseus felt a growing sense of dread. So much time had passed since he had left, months, perhaps more than a year. What had happened to his mother in his absence? Had Polydectes forced her to marry him, believing that Perseus was dead? Had something worse occurred? Perseus urged more speed from the winged sandals, desperate to find out. When they landed on Seriphos, the first person they encountered was a fisherman who recognized Perseus. The man's face showed both shock and relief at seeing Perseus alive. The fisherman quickly told Perseus what had been happening on the island in his absence. King Polydectes, convinced that Perseus would never return from the quest, because no one ever returned from attempting to kill a Gorgon, had indeed moved to force Danae into marriage. But Danae had refused, fleeing the palace and taking refuge with Dictys in a temple dedicated to Zeus. There she and Dictys had remained, claiming sanctuary, while Polydectes raged and threatened, but did not dare to violate the temple's sanctity by forcibly removing them. Perseus felt relief wash over him. His mother was safe, at least for now, but he knew that Polydectes would not give up easily, and the sanctuary of the temple could only protect Danae and Dictys for so long. It was time to end this threat permanently. Perseus asked the fisherman where Polydectes could be found, and the answer was not surprising. The king was in his palace, dining with his courtiers and supporters, confident that Perseus was dead, and that it was only a matter of time before Danae had to surrender. Perseus left Andromeda with the fisherman, asking him to keep her safe and take her to the temple where Danae and Dictys waited. Then, still wearing the kibisis with Medusa's head inside, he made his way to the palace of Polydectes. The guards at the entrance tried to stop him, not believing at first that this was Perseus, the youth they had thought long dead. But Perseus pushed past them and strode into the great hall where Polydectes was holding court. The king sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by his nobles and cronies, all of them eating and drinking, laughing and boasting. When Perseus entered, a hush fell over the assembly. Polydectes stared at the young man in disbelief, his face going pale.
Perseus?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "How can you be alive? The Gorgons—" "Are less dangerous than you thought," Perseus interrupted, his voice cold and hard. "I have returned, Polydectes, and I have brought you the gift you demanded. You wanted the head of Medusa. I have it here." He patted the kibisis at his side. Polydectes' expression shifted from shock to fear to anger. He stood up from his seat, and his hand moved toward the sword at his belt. Around the table, the nobles and supporters also tensed, preparing for violence. They could see in Perseus's eyes that this would not be a pleasant homecoming, that the young man who had left Seriphos months ago had returned as something else, something more dangerous. "You lie," Polydectes said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You could not have succeeded where so many heroes before you have failed. This is some trick, some deception." "No trick," Perseus replied. "You wanted proof? Then let me show you."
Before Polydectes could respond, Perseus reached into the kibisis and pulled out Medusa's head, holding it high for everyone in the hall to see. For a brief instant, every person in that room looked directly at the Gorgon's face, and in that instant, they all turned to stone. Polydectes became a statue in mid-motion, forever frozen, reaching for his sword, his face locked in an expression of terror and realization. The nobles around the table became stone figures, sitting in their chairs or half standing, raising cups or reaching for weapons that would never be grasped. The servants and guards became statues in various poses of surprise or attempted flight. Perseus looked around the hall at the stone figures, feeling both satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction because he had finally ended the threat to his mother, had punished the king who had sent him on what was meant to be a fatal quest. Sorrow because once again he had used Medusa's curse to kill, had turned living people into stone, had continued the Gorgon's legacy of petrification even after her death. The head had become his weapon, a tool he wielded with devastating effectiveness. But each time he used it, Perseus felt a little more corrupted, a little more like a monster himself. But it was done. Polydectes was dead, truly and permanently dead, turned to stone along with all those who had supported his schemes. Perseus returned the head to the kibisis and left the palace, emerging into the sunlight of Seriphos, feeling both triumphant and exhausted. He made his way to the temple where his mother and Dictys waited, and their reunion was one of the greatest joys of Perseus's life. Danae wept to see her son alive and safe. Dictys embraced Perseus like the son he had never had, and when Perseus introduced them to Andromeda, they welcomed her into the family with open arms and hearts. With Polydectes dead, and no other strong claimant to the throne of Seriphos, the people of the island unanimously chose Dictys to be their new king. The good fisherman who had saved Danae and Perseus so many years ago, who had protected them and asked for nothing in return, now found himself ruler of the island. Dictys accepted the responsibility with humility, and his reign would be remembered as just and kind, in stark contrast to that of his brother. But Perseus knew that his work was not quite finished. He had the magical items borrowed from the gods and the nymphs, and they needed to be returned. More importantly, he had Medusa's head, and he knew he could not keep such a dangerous artifact. It was too powerful, too tempting, and Perseus feared that if he held on to it much longer, he would become dependent on it, would start to see it as the solution to every problem, rather than as the terrible weapon it was. Perseus sought out Hermes and Athena, and the gods appeared to him on the shores of Seriphos. He returned the winged sandals, the cap of Hades, the kibisis, and the sword, thanking the gods for their aid and telling them of his adventures. Athena listened to his account with particular interest, especially his description of Medusa's death. When Perseus finished his tale, Athena held out her hand for the Gorgon's head. "This belongs to me," the goddess said,
her voice difficult to read. "I will mount it on my aegis, my shield, and there it will serve as both weapon and warning." Perseus willingly gave the head to Athena, relieved to be rid of it. The goddess took the severed head and affixed it to the center of her shield, where it would remain forever after. The aegis, already a powerful piece of divine armor, became even more formidable with the addition of the Gorgon's face, able to turn enemies to stone and strike terror into the hearts of those who opposed the goddess.
With the magical items returned and Medusa's head no longer his burden, Perseus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had completed his impossible quest, saved his mother, avenged himself on Polydectes, and found a wife he loved deeply. Most men would have been content with these accomplishments, would have settled down in Seriphos to live out their days in peace. But Perseus was the son of Zeus, a demigod, and his destiny was not yet complete. There remained the matter of the prophecy that had started everything, the oracle's declaration that Acrisius would be killed by his grandson. Perseus knew about the prophecy now. His mother had told him the full story during their reunion, explaining why Acrisius had locked her in the bronze chamber and cast them out to sea. Perseus had no desire to kill his grandfather, felt no anger toward Acrisius despite the king's attempts to prevent his birth and then to ensure his death. The prophecy troubled Perseus deeply. He did not want to be the instrument of anyone's death, let alone a family member's, no matter how distant or estranged that family member might be. But Perseus also understood something about prophecies that his grandfather had not. They could not be avoided by running away or by preemptive action. If the fates had decreed that Acrisius would die by his grandson's hand, then it would happen regardless of what anyone did to prevent it. The very attempts to avoid a prophecy often set in motion the chain of events that fulfilled it. This was a truth as old as the oracle itself, demonstrated again and again in Greek mythology. Oedipus's father, trying to avoid the prophecy of patricide, had abandoned his son, setting in motion the events that led to Oedipus unknowingly killing him. Acrisius, trying to prevent his death by imprisoning Danae, had led directly to Perseus's birth and eventual return. Perseus decided that the best course of action was to stay away from Argos entirely. If he never went to his grandfather's kingdom, if he never met Acrisius, then perhaps the prophecy could be circumvented, or at least delayed indefinitely. He would build a life elsewhere, with Andromeda, with his mother and Dictys on Seriphos, and he would simply never go to Argos. It seemed like a reasonable plan, but fate, as always, had other ideas. Word came to Seriphos that there were athletic games being held in the city of Larissa, far to the north. These were to be great games, with competitors coming from all over Greece to compete in various contests of strength and skill. Perseus, who had always been athletic and who now had a reputation as a great hero, was invited to attend and participate. He debated refusing, but Andromeda and Danae both encouraged him to go. It would be good for him, they said, to do something normal, something that wasn't related to quests or prophecies or monsters. And Larissa was nowhere near Argos, so there was no risk of encountering Acrisius. Perseus agreed and traveled to Larissa for the games. He competed in several events, including the discus throw, an event that tested both strength and precision. The discus was a heavy circular stone that competitors would spin and then release, trying to throw it as far as possible. Perseus was good at this event, his strength and his training giving him an advantage. On the day of the discus competition, Perseus took his place and prepared to throw. The stadium was full of spectators, people from various cities who had come to watch the games. Perseus did not know most of them, did not pay much attention to the crowd. He was focused on his throw, on the weight of the discus in his hand, on the timing and technique required to achieve a good distance.
He spun, building momentum, and released the discus at the peak of his rotation. It flew from his hand in a perfect arc, sailing far across the field. But then, something went wrong. A gust of wind caught the discus, or perhaps the spin was slightly off, Or perhaps it was simply the workings of fate that could not be denied. Whatever the cause, the discus veered off course, flying into the crowd of spectators instead of landing safely in the field. There was a cry of alarm, and then a terrible silence. People rushed to a spot in the stands where the discus had struck someone. Perseus, horrified, ran over to see what had happened. The discus had hit an elderly man in the head, killing him instantly. And when Perseus finally saw the dead man's face, his blood turned to ice in his veins. It was Acrisius, king of Argos, who had been visiting Larissa to attend the games and watch the competitions. The prophecy was fulfilled, not through any intention or malice on Perseus's part, not through any scheme or plan, but through a simple accident at an athletic event. Acrisius had spent his entire life trying to avoid this fate, had imprisoned his daughter, had cast his grandson into the sea, had fled Argos entirely when he learned Perseus still lived, and none of it had mattered. He had come to Larissa to watch games, and there he had been killed by his own grandson, just as the oracle had foretold. Perseus was devastated. He had never wanted this, had actively tried to prevent it, but the prophecy had found a way to fulfill itself regardless of anyone's wishes or efforts. The weight of this realization pressed down on Perseus like a physical force. No matter how hard you tried, no matter what precautions you took, fate would have its way. The gods or the fates or whatever power governed these things would ensure that prophecies came true. There was an investigation, of course. The officials of the games needed to determine if the death was truly accidental or if Perseus had somehow thrown the discus deliberately at Acrisius. But every witness agreed that it was a genuine accident, a fluke of wind and timing that no one could have prevented or predicted. Perseus was cleared of any criminal responsibility, but he carried the guilt nonetheless. His grandfather was dead, killed by his hand, and the prophecy that had shaped his entire existence was now complete. According to the laws and customs of ancient Greece, Perseus should have inherited the throne of Argos as Acrisius's heir, but Perseus could not bring himself to claim it. The kingdom felt tainted to him, a reminder of his grandfather's fear and the tragedy that fear had created. Moreover, Perseus did not want to rule over people who might see him as his grandfather's murderer, accident or not. So Perseus made an arrangement with Megapenthes, the son of Protus, who was Acrisius's brother. Megapenthes ruled over the nearby kingdom of Tiryns. Perseus proposed a trade. Megapenthes would take the throne of Argos, and Perseus would become king of Tiryns. Megapenthes readily agreed to this exchange, and so Perseus and Andromeda came to rule Tiryns, a kingdom that held no memories of prophecies or fear, where they could make a fresh start. But even Tiryns did not remain their ultimate home. Perseus, driven by a desire to create something entirely new, something completely his own, founded a new city in the Argolid plain. He called this city Mycenae, and it would become one of the most important centers of Bronze Age civilization in Greece. Under Perseus's rule and that of his descendants, Mycenae grew into a powerful kingdom, its walls built with stones so massive that later Greeks believed they had been constructed by the Cyclopes themselves. Perseus and Andromeda's life together in Mycenae was long and, by the standards of Greek heroic tales, remarkably happy. They had many children together. Sources vary on the exact number, but most accounts agree on 7 sons and 2 daughters. Their sons were Perses, ancestor of the Persian kings, Alcaeus, Sthenelus, Helios, Mestor, Electryon, and Cinorus. Their daughters were Gorgophone, Gorgon slayer, named in honor of her father's greatest deed, and Autochtha. Through these children, Perseus founded the Perseid dynasty, a royal line that would dominate the Argolid region for generations. More importantly, the Perseid bloodline would eventually produce Greece's greatest hero, Heracles. Alcmene, the mother of Heracles, was the daughter of Electryon, who was the son of Perseus, making Heracles Perseus's great-grandson. Thus, Perseus became the ancestor of the hero who would perform the 12 labors and eventually ascend to Olympus to become a god himself. Perseus ruled Mycenae wisely and well, using the lessons he had learned during his quest to guide his decisions. He had seen divine injustice, had witnessed the consequences of hubris and fear, had experienced both the power and the burden of heroism. These experiences made him a thoughtful and measured ruler, one who considered the consequences of his actions and who tried to govern with both strength and compassion. The story of Perseus and Andromeda became one of the most celebrated tales in all of Greek mythology, told and retold across the ancient world. Poets sang of Perseus's courage in facing the Gorgon. Artists depicted the moment of Medusa's beheading, and parents told their children about the hero who turned a monster's power against itself. But the story also evolved over time, taking on different meanings and emphases depending on who was telling it and why. In ancient Argos and Mycenae, Perseus was celebrated as a founder hero, the ancestor of kings, proof that their ruling dynasties descended from Zeus himself. Temples and shrines were dedicated to him, and his tomb was said to be in Mycenae, though no one knew its exact location, as was often the case with heroes' graves. Annual festivals commemorated his deeds, and young men aspiring to heroism prayed for Perseus to grant them courage and success in their endeavors. But Perseus's story was not just a tale of heroic triumph, it was also a meditation on fate, on the futility of trying to avoid destiny, on the ways that prophecies fulfill themselves despite all efforts to prevent them. Acrisius's attempt to escape his prophesied death had led directly to that death. Perseus's quest to save his mother had transformed him into a hero capable of accidentally killing his grandfather. The very thing Acrisius feared and tried to prevent, having a grandson, was what made the prophecy possible in the first place. If Acrisius had never imprisoned Danae, if he had allowed her to marry normally, would the prophecy still have come true? Perhaps, or perhaps not, but his fear ensured that it would. When Perseus grew old, he and Andromeda were both placed among the stars, becoming constellations that still shine in the night sky. Perseus with his sword raised, forever frozen in the act of heroism. Andromeda with her arms outstretched, remembering the moment when she was chained to the rock. Near them in the sky are Cepheus and Cassiopeia, Andromeda's parents, and Cetus the sea monster, all immortalized in the heavens as a reminder of the events that had unfolded on the Ethiopian shore so long ago. The constellations served a practical purpose for ancient sailors and travelers, helping them navigate by the stars, but they also served as a perpetual reminder of the myth, ensuring that Perseus's story would never be forgotten. Every night, people could look up at the sky and see the hero, the princess, and the monster, an eternal frozen moment of triumph and tragedy. Psychological analysis and the hero's journey. When we examine Perseus's myth through the lens of modern psychology and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey framework, we find a story rich with symbolic meaning that extends far beyond its surface narrative of monster slaying and adventure. Perseus's journey exemplifies the classic monomyth structure, while also offering unique variations that reflect the specific concerns and values of ancient Greek culture. The call to adventure and supernatural aid. Perseus's story begins with what Campbell would call the extraordinary birth. He is conceived through divine intervention, literally brought into existence by Zeus's desire and power. But unlike many heroes who are abandoned because they are dangerous or unwanted,
Perseus is abandoned because his very existence threatens others, his grandfather's life. This inverts the typical pattern, where the hero is the one in danger. From birth, Perseus represents potential change, potential overthrow of the old order, and this makes him both blessed and cursed. The call to adventure comes not from any internal desire or external summons from the cosmos, but from a deliberate trap set by Polectides. This is significant because it means Perseus's heroic journey begins not with destiny calling him to greatness, but with a petty tyrant trying to get him killed. The quest is imposed on him, not chosen freely. This reflects a common Greek theme. Heroes often become heroes not because they want to, but because circumstances force them to rise to challenges they would rather avoid. However, Perseus does receive substantial supernatural aid, more than almost any other hero in Greek mythology. Hermes, Athena, the nymphs, even Zeus himself working behind the scenes, Perseus benefits from divine assistance at nearly every step. This has led some scholars to argue that Perseus is less the hero of his own story and more the beneficiary of divine favor, a lucky hero rather than a hard-working hero like Heracles or Odysseus. But this interpretation misses something important. The divine aid Perseus receives is not just handed to him randomly. It comes because he is Zeus's son, yes, but also because he accepts his quest rather than fleeing from it. The gods help those who attempt impossible things, who show courage in the face of certain death. Perseus's willingness to try to slay Medusa, despite having no idea how to accomplish it, is what attracts divine attention. The aid comes after he commits to the journey, not before. Crossing the threshold, the Graeae, and the world beyond. Perseus's encounter with the Graeae represents the crossing of the threshold from the known world into the realm of myth and magic. The Grey Sisters are literally figures from before the Olympian order, representatives of an older, stranger world. By tricking them and forcing them to give up their knowledge, Perseus demonstrates not just cunning, but a willingness to do whatever is necessary to achieve his goal. This is not noble heroism in the modern sense, it's pragmatic determination, a recognition that when you're dealing with beings from the old chaotic world, conventional morality may not apply.
This threshold crossing also represents Perseus's acceptance that he cannot accomplish his quest through normal means. He cannot simply be brave or strong or skilled. He must embrace the magical, the supernatural, the world beyond normal human experience. In psychological terms, this represents the hero venturing into the unconscious, into the realm of dreams and symbols and archetypes that lie beneath the surface of everyday consciousness. In Freudian psychology, Medusa's face has been interpreted as representing castration anxiety, the terror of emasculation, symbolized by the woman with phallic symbols, the snakes, on her head. The act of beheading her becomes a symbolic castration of the castrating figure, Perseus mastering his fear by turning it back on itself. This interpretation, while dated in some respects, captures something real about the gendered dynamics of the myth. From a Jungian perspective, Medusa represents the shadow, the repressed feminine, the anima in its most threatening aspect. She is what happens when the feminine is rejected, cursed, driven away, rather than integrated into the psyche. Perseus's task is not just to kill her, but to look at her, to face what has been made monstrous, albeit indirectly through the shield's reflection. This indirect gaze is crucial. It suggests that we cannot confront our deepest fears and shadows directly without being destroyed by them. We need distance, mediation, reflection to process what is too overwhelming to face head-on. The mirror shield is one of the most psychologically significant objects in the myth. It allows Perseus to see without being seen in return,
to observe without being destroyed by the observation. This is the essence of consciousness itself, the ability to observe our own minds, to reflect on our thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed by them. The shield represents the reflective capacity of consciousness, the ability to create distance between ourselves and our experiences. Moreover, the mirror reverses the Gorgon's power. Medusa's gaze petrifies what it sees, turning life into stone, dynamic being into static object. The mirror reverses this flow, allowing Perseus to see Medusa without Medusa seeing him, to maintain his subjectivity while treating her as object. This reversal is key to his victory. He uses her own power against her through the intermediary of reflection. The transformation of violence, from victim to victor to villain. One of the most psychologically complex aspects of Perseus's story is how he relates to Medusa's power after her death. By taking her head and using it as a weapon, Perseus becomes in a sense an extension of Medusa's curse. He petrifies Cetus, he petrifies Phineus and his men, he petrifies Polydectes and his court. In doing so, Perseus perpetuates the very thing he destroyed. The victim, Medusa, had become a victimizer. Perseus, the victor over Medusa, now becomes a victimizer himself, using her power. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism and violence. Has Perseus truly defeated what Medusa represented, or has he simply claimed her power for himself? Has he ended the cycle of petrification, or has he just taken control of it? These questions don't have easy answers, and the ancient Greeks likely didn't intend them to. But they resonate with modern understanding of trauma, abuse, and the ways that victims can become perpetrators, that survivors can internalize the violence done to them. The fact that Perseus eventually gives up the head, returns it to Athena rather than keeping it for himself, is significant. It suggests some level of recognition that this power is too dangerous to hold permanently, that no mortal should possess such absolute power over life and death. By giving it to Athena, Perseus returns it to the divine realm where it belongs, acknowledging that some powers are too great for humans to wield responsibly.
Fate and free will, the inescapable prophecy. The prophecy that Acrisius would be killed by his grandson is perhaps the most philosophically profound element of Perseus's myth. It raises fundamental questions about fate, free will, and the nature of causality that the Greeks grappled with throughout their philosophical and dramatic traditions. Acrisius's attempts to avoid the prophecy, imprisoning Danae, casting Perseus into the sea, are what create the conditions that make the prophecy possible. If Acrisius had accepted the prophecy and simply waited for whatever would happen, would it still have come true? The myth seems to suggest that yes, it would have, but perhaps in a different and less tragic way. By trying to prevent it, Acrisius set in motion a chain of events that guaranteed it would happen in the worst possible way for everyone involved. This is a theme that recurs throughout Greek mythology and drama. Prophecies that are avoided come true. Prophecies that are accepted often turn out differently than expected. Oedipus's entire tragedy stems from attempts to avoid prophecy. But Perseus, crucially, didn't try to avoid the prophecy. He didn't know about it until after his quest, and when he learned of it, he made reasonable efforts to stay away from his grandfather without obsessing over it or letting it paralyze him. Yet the prophecy still came true through an accident that no one could have prevented or predicted. From a psychological perspective, this can be read as commentary on anxiety and self-fulfilling prophecies. Our fears about the future, our attempts to control what cannot be controlled, often create the very outcomes we most want to avoid. Acrisius's fear of death by his grandson's hand led him to actions that guaranteed exactly that outcome.
Perseus's relative lack of fear about the prophecy, his decision to simply live his life and be careful without becoming paranoid, couldn't prevent the prophecy, but at least allowed him to live fully in the meantime. The discus accident that fulfills the prophecy is also symbolically rich. It's completely random and accidental, yet it's also the direct result of Perseus's choices to attend the games, to compete, to throw the discus. It suggests that fate works not through external force, but through the accumulation of our choices and actions, through the normal course of living our lives. We don't have to do anything special for fate to manifest. We just have to exist and act, and fate finds its way through the choices we make.
The lucky hero versus the suffering hero. Perseus is often contrasted with Heracles, his great-grandson, as representing two different types of heroes in Greek mythology. Heracles is the suffering hero, the one who earns his achievements through tremendous effort and pain, who is constantly tested and who often fails before ultimately succeeding. Perseus is the lucky hero, the one who receives divine gifts, who succeeds at impossible tasks through divine assistance more than personal merit, who doesn't have to suffer much to achieve his goals. But this contrast oversimplifies both heroes. Perseus does suffer. He's abandoned as an infant, grows up in poverty, is sent on a suicide quest by a jealous king, accidentally kills his grandfather. His success comes not just from divine aid, but from his willingness to use intelligence, the mirror shield, to ask for help from the gods, from the nymphs, and to do difficult things, tricking the Grei, facing Medusa. And while Heracles suffers more dramatically and more extensively, he also receives divine aid throughout his labors. The difference is perhaps one of tone and emphasis. Perseus's story emphasizes divine favor, quick thinking, and single great deeds. Heracles' story emphasizes perseverance, suffering, redemption through ordeal, and multiple trials over years. Both are valid models of heroism, and both appear in Greek mythology because the Greeks understood that there are many paths to greatness. From a psychological development standpoint, Perseus represents a faster, more graceful maturation. He goes from youth to proven hero in a relatively short time with one great quest. Heracles represents a longer, harder process of transformation, more akin to the lifelong process of individuation that Jung described. Both models exist in human psychology. Some people have transformative experiences that change them quickly. Others require years of hard work and repeated trials to achieve similar growth. Andromeda, the reward and the relationship. In Campbell's hero's journey, the hero often wins the hand of the goddess or finds a romantic partner as part of their reward for completing their quest. Andromeda certainly fills this role in Perseus's story, but she's more than just a prize to be won. Her situation parallels Perseus's in interesting ways. Like Perseus, she's innocent of any wrongdoing, but is being punished anyway. Like Perseus, she's the victim of forces beyond her control, her mother's hubris, the gods' anger. Like Perseus, she's facing death through no fault of her own. Perseus's decision to save Andromeda is spontaneous, driven by compassion rather than calculation. He doesn't know she's a princess or that her rescue will lead to marriage and political advantage. He simply sees someone in danger and chooses to help. This is important because it shows that Perseus's heroism isn't just about completing his quest or proving himself. It's also about responding to suffering when he sees it, about using his power and abilities to help others even when he gains nothing from it. Their relationship, from what little we see of it in the ancient sources, seems to be one of genuine partnership and love. Andromeda is not a passive prize, but an active participant in their life together. She bears his children, rules beside him in Mycenae,
and is eventually immortalized alongside him in the stars. This suggests a more balanced relationship than was typical in Greek hero myths, where wives were often afterthoughts or sources of tragedy. From a Jungian perspective, Andromeda might represent the anima, the feminine aspect of Perseus's psyche that he needs to integrate to become whole. Her rescue and their marriage symbolize this integration, Perseus accepting and incorporating the feminine that had been rejected and made monstrous in Medusa. But this interpretation risks reducing Andromeda to a symbol rather than recognizing her as a character in her own right, with her own experiences and agency.
The hero as founder, from adventure to civilization. Perseus's journey doesn't end with his quest completed, unlike many modern hero narratives. He doesn't retire to enjoy his victory. Instead, he becomes a founder of cities, an establisher of dynasties, a creator of lasting civilization. This is the final stage of the hero's journey, bringing the boon back to benefit society, using what was learned and gained in the quest to improve the ordinary world. Perseus founds Mycenae, establishing a kingdom that would become central to Greek civilization. His descendants include not just Heracles, but many other significant figures in Greek mythology and pseudo-history. This transition from adventurer to founder is crucial in understanding Greek heroism. Heroes weren't valuable just because they killed monsters. They were valuable because they established order, founded cities, created dynasties that would rule for generations. This reflects the Greek understanding that civilization, the polis, the city-state, was the highest human achievement. Individual glory was impressive, but using that glory to create lasting institutions that would benefit others was the true mark of greatness. Perseus embodies this progression from chaos, the Gorgons, the sea monster, to order, the founded city, the established dynasty. Psychologically, this represents the integration of the heroic journey's lessons into everyday life. Perseus could have remained focused on his own glory, could have continued adventuring, seeking out new monsters to slay and new impossible tasks to complete. Instead, he settled down, married, had children, ruled wisely, and created something that would outlast him. This is the mature hero, the one who uses their exceptional experiences not to remain exceptional, but to contribute to the ordinary, the communal, the civilized world that makes life possible for everyone. Conclusion and cultural impact. The story of Perseus and Medusa has resonated through Western culture for over 2.5 millennia, and its influence shows no signs of diminishing. In ancient Greece, Perseus was celebrated as both hero and ancestor, his story told in various forms, from epic poetry to dramatic tragedy, depicted on countless vase paintings and sculptural reliefs. The Romans eagerly adopted his myth, associating Perseus with their own heroes and emperors. Renaissance artists found in Perseus's story the perfect marriage of classical form and dramatic action, creating some of their most famous works based on his deeds. Benvenuto Cellini's bronze sculpture of Perseus holding Medusa's severed head, completed in 1554, stands in Florence as one of the masterpieces of Renaissance sculpture, a work so technically difficult and so dramatically powerful that it has influenced artists for centuries. Antonio Canova's later marble version brought neoclassical elegance to the same subject. These sculptures and countless paintings transformed Perseus from a mythological figure into an icon of masculine heroism, courage, and triumph over monstrous femininity. But the story's meaning has evolved significantly over time. Modern and contemporary artists and writers have increasingly focused not on Perseus, but on Medusa, reinterpreting her as a figure of feminine power, rage, and victimhood. Feminist scholars have pointed out that Medusa was punished for being raped, that her monstrousness was created by patriarchal divine authority,
that her story is really about how women who are violated are transformed into threats that must be destroyed. From this perspective, Perseus becomes not the hero, but the agent of patriarchal violence, the one who finishes the job Athena started by killing the woman whose only crime was being beautiful enough to attract a god's attention. This reinterpretation reached a cultural peak in 2008 when Luciano Garbati created his sculpture Medusa with the head of Perseus, reversing the traditional iconography to show Medusa triumphant, holding Perseus's head. This image has been adopted by feminist movements as a symbol of female power and justified rage against male violence. The statue's installation in New York City in 2020 generated significant public discussion about victims, victimizers, and how we choose to represent heroes and monsters.
The myth has appeared in countless modern adaptations, from Ray Harryhausen's iconic stop-motion effects in the 1981 film Clash of the Titans to the 2010 remake and beyond. Young adult novels have retold the story from various perspectives. Video games have featured Perseus as a playable character, his quest transformed into interactive adventure. Each adaptation brings its own interpretation, its own emphasis, its own values to the ancient tale. What makes Perseus's story so enduring? Perhaps it's the perfect crystallization of core mythological themes: the hero's journey, the monster that must be slain, the prophecy that cannot be avoided, the divine interference in mortal affairs, the innocent punished, and the guilty escaping unscathed. Or perhaps it's the psychological richness of the symbolism, the mirror that allows us to see what we cannot face directly, the severed head that retains its power even in death, the transformation from victim to monster to weapon. Or perhaps, most fundamentally, it's about facing fear. Perseus must face the ultimate fear, death itself, represented by Medusa's petrifying gaze, and find a way to overcome it not through brute force, but through intelligence, reflection, and divine assistance. This is something every human can relate to. We all face things that threaten to paralyze us, to turn us to stone. We all must find ways to look at our fears indirectly, through mirrors and metaphors, so we can understand and overcome them without being destroyed in the process. The story also reminds us that our attempts to control fate often backfire, that prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves through the very actions we take to prevent them, that fear often creates the outcomes we most dread. Acrisius's tragedy is as relevant now as it was in ancient Greece. How many of our problems are created by our desperate attempts to avoid them? How often does our fear of something make it inevitable? And there's the troubling question of justice and divine power. Medusa's fate haunts the myth, raising questions that the ancient Greeks may not have fully addressed, but which resonate strongly in our modern consciousness. What does it mean that the gods punish victims for their own violations? What does it mean that heroism sometimes requires us to perpetuate violence, to use the tools of the monster we've defeated? What does it mean to be a hero in a world where the gods themselves are unjust? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's why the myth continues to fascinate us. It's not a simple tale of good versus evil, hero versus monster. It's a complex story about power, fate, justice, transformation, and the ambiguous nature of heroism itself. Perseus is both hero and accidental murderer, both blessed by gods and burdened by prophecy, both destroyer of the monstrous and wielder of monstrous power.
As you drift toward sleep, consider the image of Perseus frozen in the stars, sword raised, forever young, forever victorious in that moment before he brought down his blade. And consider Medusa, the victim who became a monster, whose face still graces Athena's shield,
whose power, even in death, continues to petrify. And consider Andromeda, innocent, suffering witness to her own rescue, chained to her rock in the sky as eternal reminder of a price that should never have been demanded. These stories matter not because they happened, they didn't, not literally, but because they tell us something true about being human, about facing impossible challenges, about the ways we deal with fear and fate and the injustices of the world. Perseus's journey from fisherman's son to hero to king to constellation is, in miniature, the journey we all make, from innocence through trial to wisdom, from powerlessness through agency to legacy. May your own trials bring you wisdom rather than bitterness. May your reflections allow you to face what you fear without being destroyed by it. And may you, like Perseus, find companions worthy of the journey and a legacy worth leaving behind. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Perseus and Medusa, one of mythology's most enduring and complex tales, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. We bring you comprehensive examinations of classical mythology every week, diving deep into the stories that have shaped Western culture and exploring the timeless wisdom hidden in these ancient narratives. Until next time, may you face your Gorgons with wisdom and courage, and may your victories bring you peace rather than burden.